Right now, we are seeing that the United States and Israel are, it seems that they are preparing to fight Yemen Houthis. How serious is that in your opinion, and why they're doing this?
Well, the whole situation is very serious because there is no end game in sight. Israel is trying to impose solutions in the region that are unacceptable. First, domination over Palestine in an unconditional way through its military power backed by the United States, and it's making threats against other parts of the Middle East. So this could obviously spiral into a wider war very soon. And it's all premised on Israeli government policies that are, in my opinion, flagrantly against international law and international decency.
Why the United States, why the Biden administration, instead of going after negotiation, finding some political solution to this issue, they're prepared to do everything, whatever the Netanyahu administration is asking for?
This is a neocon policy to fight wars anywhere and everywhere, to always escalate, and to believe that not only does might make right, but that might can solve political issues. It's pathetic, but it's not really different from other dimensions of U.S. policy. It's just blatant, flagrant arrogance and disregard for international law and disregard for what global opinion and American opinion say. After all, the world overwhelmingly has called for a ceasefire. And in the most recent UN General Assembly vote, it was 153 countries calling for a ceasefire, and the population of those countries is 89% of the world population. 10 countries opposed: the United States, Israel, and a few other small countries. The total population of those that opposed was 5%, of which 4% was the United States. So the US was joined by 9 other countries that represented less than 1% of the world population. In other words, this is giving a finger, if I could put it crudely, to the rest of the world, saying, we don't care. We don't care what you say. We don't care what you call for. We don't care for peace. We'll do it the way we want to do it. This is not only the United States backing Israel, this is the United States alongside Israel, because Israel couldn't fight one day by itself. It needs the munitions every day from the United States, and it's getting them.
Yeah, you talk about ammunition. Jake Sullivan just recently said that they are taking care of this ammunition, these weapons that are sending to Israel, that they are not using against civilians. How
well, this is ridiculous. There are 18,000 dead minimum, 2 million displaced, hospitals, schools, basic physical infrastructure, apartment buildings, all destroyed. And even the New York Times, which is, of course, rabidly pro-Israel, and I mean pro-Israeli government policy, notes in an article today that a substantial proportion of the bombs are dumb bombs. They're not guided bombs. They even quote Mark Milley, the former chief of staff of the U.S. military, saying that this is wrong. You need to use guided missiles to avoid the civilian deaths and damage and injury. And of course, they're not doing that. Does Jake Sullivan know that? Of course, he knows that. This is part of a U.S. foreign policy that is as out of control as Israel's foreign policy. That's the problem.
The other issue that it's much more serious than Yemen is Hezbollah. in the north. Israelis, they were talking about if it was necessary, they want to attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah has the same rhetoric. How do you see right now the situation in that region?
It seems, although I don't have any direct evidence because I don't speak to the administration, they certainly don't speak to me, but it seems that the hardliners in Washington and the hardliners in Jerusalem in the Israeli government want a wider war. They're not taking steps to avoid a wider war. They seem to want a wider war. I think it's Netanyahu's dream that the United States goes to war with Iran. Because if Israel could get the United States to take out Iran, and that's their idea, imagine that. But all of this is grotesque cynicism and miscalculation as well, because what could happen would be devastating for the whole world if this continues to escalate. And they're playing with that. You notice that Israel hasn't taken one moment, not one measure, not one iota of an approach towards diplomacy. Nothing. No call for diplomacy. Incredible disrespect for the United Nations, disrespect for the rest of the world. Obviously saying every day we don't care about the rest of the world. We don't care about diplomacy. I think one of the things that will happen is that support in the United States for Israel will collapse. Actually, it's already collapsing among young people, and I think the collapse will be more widespread. Even that doesn't necessarily stop the U.S. government from doing what it's doing by any means, because foreign policy is hardly an area of democratic deliberation. It's a small cabal that runs things, that controls the military. They don't really ask for permission. But we see in Ukraine how an exasperated public finally has some influence on some members of Congress, enough that there isn't just a blank check for more armaments. This is very surprising given how much our Congress likes to write checks to the military industrial complex. But the public is pretty much disgusted, and Biden's support is falling sharply. We have an election year this year, so it's possible that the exasperation clearly expressed in opinion survey after opinion survey will finally result in some action by the U.S. government to put a stop to this massive devastation.
At the end of the day, what is so important is how these actions would benefit the people of Israel. What's going on in the mind of the Netanyahu administration? How possibly they can think that all these actions would benefit Israelis?
They are engaged in ethnic cleansing right now, and that is the goal of this government. This government is an extreme right-wing government. Netanyahu's party, the Likud, has, since its charter in 1977, demanded one state of Israel, commanding all of the territories of Palestine, as well as the 1967 border Israel. In other words, the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River should be Israel. That's the policy. That's the policy across the cabinet. That's the policy of these religious Zionist parties. For example, the finance minister Smotrich and the defense minister Gallant, who's Likud, and the interior minister Ben-Gvir, who is another party calling for, quote, greater Israel. That's their policy, is that there should never be a Palestine. There should never be Palestinian political rights. This is Israel. And a lot of the public supports that. And a lot of the public follows the line of the administration, the Israeli government, that is, that the only way to safety is to smash Palestine. And so the situation is going to continue, I think, if it's a matter of internal Israeli policy, but it's something that Israel can't do for a day without the United States. And the U.S. has no interest, no national interest, no ethical interest, no geopolitical interest in being an accessory to mass murder.
How do you see the left, the center, political parties in Israel? Because the left is so weak right now. Why the Netanyahu administration during all these years did this to the left, to the center?
There's basically no left in Israel. It's a few seats in the Knesset, in the parliament. The Israeli political scene has shifted to the far right over the years. It didn't just start on October 7. This is something that's been going on for years. Netanyahu represents and those parties represent a larger viewpoint. Israel's basically divided between those who oppose a Palestinian state because they think that God gave them all the land and they're going to assert their biblical claim, and those who follow the propaganda that say, well, even if it was right to have two states, there's no one on the other side that would accept that, and so better we have to use violence and force. That's the only realistic thing to do. But voices that say we need to solve these problems through following international law and through justice barely exist in Israel right now. I think this is a terrible, grave danger to Israel's survival, because the legitimacy internationally is plummeting. And I personally don't think that the American people really have much interest in being a party to this. The American people, to the extent that they signed up with Israel, signed up to a two-state solution. They did not sign up to some biblical vision of a greater Israel that controls millions of Palestinian people. They didn't sign up for that.
Putin's recent press conference, he was talking about Odessa. He said that Odessa is a Russian city. It's a huge change in his view. The United States could have saved Odessa for Ukraine if they were going to negotiate with Russia before. How do you see the situation right now in Ukraine? Is there any will in the Biden administration to go after negotiations?
No. In 2010, 2011, 2013, Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine were that Ukraine should be neutral. That's all. And Russia negotiated with the government of Ukraine a lease till the year 2042 for Sevastopol naval base. There were no demands for annexation. There were no demands for territory. There was no claim on Crimea. There was simply a pragmatic approach. Don't join the U.S. military alliance, and our military base, our naval base, which has been in Sevastopol, Crimea, since 1783, should remain there, and we want a long-term lease for that, which President Yanukovych negotiated. That's all the demands. Then the United States overthrew, or was party to the overthrow of Yanukovych. Russia took back Crimea. Even then, there were no demands for the eastern Ukrainian regions, that is the Donbass. What Russia said was stop killing ethnic Russians, give autonomy to ethnic Russians, and that became the basis for the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. The Minsk II agreement did not call for independence of the Donbass or that Russia would annex the Donbass. It just said autonomy. And it was a position backed up unanimously by the UN Security Council. But the United States said, no, we don't care. Told Ukraine, you don't have to implement that. And so that was lost. Even as late as December 2021, Putin was not making demands for territory. He was calling for the Minsk agreements to be enforced, claiming Crimea and demanding that NATO stop enlarging. Well, the United States government is deaf to the interests of any other place in the world. They're so arrogant that the position is we don't have to listen to anything. And so when President Putin put a draft security agreement on the table based on those premises that NATO would not enlarge, that the Minsk agreement would be honored finally years after it was supposed to go into effect, Biden said, nah, we don't have to negotiate. Russia launched its special military invasion in March 2022, and by then the Duma, the Russian parliament, had recognized eastern Ukraine as independent, Lugansk and Donetsk as independent, did not annex them. That came in September 2022. But in March, it recognized their independence, but Russia demanded Ukrainian neutrality and said on that basis there could be immediate peace. And Ukraine and Russia famously were close to an agreement on ending the war weeks after it had started, weeks. And the United States said no, and Britain said no. We will not support you. You fight on. Hundreds of thousands of people, Ukrainian young men, have died since then. So this is about American foreign policy, and it's so sad. It is not just demands for territory by Russia. It is the fact that Russian demands keep rising in the context of continuing rejections from the United States. Definitely, the rhetoric has turned even more aggressive, but the White House is so stupid. Sorry, in the US, they don't understand anything. But what they certainly don't understand is that Biden should call Putin and say, we've got to stop this. We don't want to see all of Ukraine destroyed. But you're right, we should never have tried to expand NATO. That was really stupid. And you told us that since 2007. That's the call that's needed. But I don't think Biden's up to it. And certainly his neocon team opposes that very premise. Fight on, basically kidnap young people off the streets of Ukrainian cities and throw them to the front line where they're dying by the hundreds, sometimes 1,000 or more per day. That's the policy.
In Europe, we are seeing that new leaders that are coming to power in Netherlands, in Slovakia, we had Orban. They are against this war in Ukraine, against sending more aids, more weapons to Ukraine. How influential would that be on the U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine?
It's having an effect, obviously. Orban by himself blocked the formal approval of the next round of European assistance. Fico in Slovakia will be joining that cause. The government in the Netherlands is still being negotiated, but the party that came out number one, as you said, Wilders, is against further aid. Of course, the new Polish government probably is pretty gung-ho for more financial and military support to Ukraine. Things are dragging out, but most of Europe does their best to follow blindly the United States. This is really tragic, though all of these cracks in the foundation are clearly appearing. What's stunning is if you look up approval rating of world leaders, and one of the websites that reports weekly opinion polling, there's not a European leader that has a net positive approval rating. Most of them are incredibly unpopular. Scholz, Jonas Gahr Støre in Norway, Macron, hugely unpopular. Their promoting war is not winning public support. There's no one in Europe that has a net positive approval rating in this group of NATO boosters, not even close. And the ratings keep going down and down. Look what's happening to Scholz in Germany. It's a collapse of public support. And in the United States, Biden does not have public support for his foreign policy.
We know that Austria are trying to block the new package of sanctions on Russia. Is that possible that Austria can make some middle ground for both sides?
I think that more and more politicians in Europe are understanding this is wrong. It was a terrible mistake. It's not working. They generally are so beholden to the United States, or for one reason or another, afraid of it or bought off, that they don't say in public what they often say in private. But there are more European politicians coming to the fore, definitely saying we've got to stop this, and that will have an effect, not from one day to the next, but it's definitely coming. Similarly, in the United States, public opinion is gone for this. Congress, which listens to the military-industrial complex, is in angst because they want to vote more money for weapons. The Democrats want to support Biden, but it's completely wrong-headed to be sending tens of billions of dollars more without even an attempt at negotiations. So I think that this is a failing policy that will come to an end. It has to, and doesn't have to, but it's very likely to in 2024. But it's agonizingly slow. And what is so frustrating is the absence of many voices of sanity. Viktor Orban in Hungary is one of them. Fico is a voice of sanity. There are very few right now.
As you mentioned, the U.S. foreign policy is so important. What's happening to the Democratic Party? We know that Cornel West, Jill Stein, even Bobby Kennedy, they're not welcome in the Democratic Party. They have to find their way of fighting in the new election. What the Democratic Party is losing for the next election? How do you see their situation?
Well, I'll give you a personal answer. They lost my vote. I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote Democratic basically all my life. And I have left the party. And I put it in personal terms because I think I reflect a view that is quite widespread. The Democratic Party for me is unrecognizable right now. When I joined the Democrats, I joined originally in the 1960s as I was still in high school, so I was a kid. But the idea was, it was at least the part of our political system that was against the Vietnam War. And there was always a strong leftist part of the Democratic Party that was anti-war. And that was what I felt was my home. Now there isn't any anti-war part of the Democratic Party at all. Not in the Congressional Democratic Party, not in the White House. You don't find, other than a very, very few people, any voice for this right now. All the mainstream voices are more war, more funding. The Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, was at school same time I was at Harvard. I've known him for many, many decades. What's his role right now? Well, keep the Senate in session so that we can still send more money to Ukraine. It's terrible. There's no thinking anymore. It's incredibly ignorant. And this is across the Democratic Party. So it's really quite upsetting.
Is the political arena of the United States ready to have a third party, even fourth party? We have Bobby Kennedy, who was not welcome in the Democratic Party. I don't know what they're thinking of, but he has a very good chance of getting more votes from the Democratic Party. We have Cornel West and Jill Stein. Those are so important candidates to make some equilibrium within the Democratic Party.
I think the mainstream Democrats are extremely confused and befuddled, and the wrong message, and they've lost their way. And Biden is a terrible candidate and has been basically a warmonger during this whole period. So it is a position that is outside of American public opinion right now. They've opened the door more for Trump than just about anything else. I sensed it from the beginning that, strangely, because it's a principle of American politics that foreign policy is not decisive, I said, you're going to go down on the foreign policy, which is really something. It was so bad, so misconceived. I wrote a few articles about that this makes no sense, even politically, much less geopolitically, if I could put it that way. It makes no sense in terms of domestic politics. And this is how things are playing out right now. The American public rejects Biden's foreign policy. He is not going to win re-election, most likely, and certainly not on this approach.
And I want you to specifically comment on Cornel West and Jill Stein. Because
they're fine people. They're not going to be president, most likely. They're fine people. Bobby Kennedy has a much larger following and a much larger position in the polls. And we'll see what the dynamics are now. There are, Cornel West is a wonderful person. I've been friendly with him for decades. I don't know Jill Stein personally. But it's Bobby Kennedy that has the name, the public recognition, the position in the opinion polls, and he certainly has an open chance. I urge him all the time: be the candidate of peace. You'll win if you're the candidate of peace. This is really important. This is what the American people want.
Is it possible for him to convince Cornel West or even Jill Stein to be part of his campaign?
Well, I think right now, they're each going to do their thing. They're each going to run. We're still almost a year away from the election, so a lot can happen between now and next November, and we'll see. But for the moment, they're going to campaign, right now, Bobby Kennedy shows up in the opinion surveys typically between 10 and 20% of support. That's a lot for a third-party candidate, and we're early days because most Americans are not really focused on the elections. This is still very much a professional politician thing at this point, and it will only start to heat up at the beginning of next year with primaries and caucuses, and then we'll see how things evolve.
Just before wrapping up this session, I want to know your opinion on this U.S. economic war on China. How is it going with these two conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel? We know that China is they're doing their way, they're growing. And how do you see right now in the U.S.? Are they focused on the economy? Are they focused on these wars? How these wars going to benefit the economy?
It is pretty much taken for granted among the mainstream of both the Democratic and the Republican parties, I have to say, that China's an enemy. And the rhetoric vis-a-vis China is extremely stupid, low-level, ignorant, and dangerous. And this is both parties, because even parts of the Republican Party that are not interested in the Ukraine war, want to stop the funding, to a significant extent say, yes, because we need the resources to fight China. And so there's a kind of comic book feeling to it that, oh, there could be a war with China. That would just be fine and dandy. Of course, it could end the world. It's so reckless and dangerous, the way that our politicians talk, the way the mainstream media report things, say, yeah, coming war with China, as if that's a normal kind of statement, as opposed to something absolutely horrifying. And the rhetoric about Taiwan, as if Taiwan is the 51st American state, as if the United States doesn't have a one China diplomatic policy, which they seem to forget. It's all quite dangerous. The U.S., starting with Trump, actually starting with Obama in political ways, starting with Trump in trade policies, and now with Biden in trade policies, finance policies, technology policies, is really leaning hard against China. It's doing some damage to Chinese macroeconomics in the short term, because it's really stopped the growth of China's exports to the U.S. market, and Europe has broadly gone along with this. And so that is hurting a bit, but I think China has ways around that, including expanding its role in the non-US, non-EU world, and I expect that to happen. China's underlying strengths for growth are very strong. It's a high-saving society with excellent education and very strong research, development, and enterprises that are at the cutting edge of many technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or renewable energy or advanced computation. China has great depth and strength. So this is not a fly-by-night economy. This is a very serious and sophisticated economy with a lot of geopolitical support. And I don't think the United States can, quote, contain China. It's a terrible idea, an absurd idea, a dangerous idea, and I don't think possibly a successful idea.